globe. I wish to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we gather today. I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. In particular, I pay respect to the Wurundjeri people on whose lands I live and work. My presentation is called Of Space, People and Light. And how I wish to connect with you today is through the knowledge that how we bring light into a space improve the qualities of people's lives. And the medium I'm going to use today is hospitals, specifically the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne and Bendigo Hospital in Victoria. Now, on the Royal Children's Hospital, NDY Light's role was to design the public front of house areas and the external landscaping spaces, as well as advising the electrical engineers about lighting within their scope. We were faced with the challenge of creating a fun, non-institutional solution which didn't create dust shelves or risk of contamination or infection control. Some of the ways we did that include creating a custom wipe down pendant to go over the nurses' stations, placing into the landscape large fun shapes which became luminous balls at night time, breaking up a grid of lights and using shape and colour and location to create interest and variation, such as light bubbles across the ceiling. We also, in this space particularly, had the challenge of not creating excessive light spill into the aquarium and disturbing their life cycle. And we added in colour. Each level of the hospital had a different theme, and so we provided colour to the pendants to create a non-institutional space. The next stage was comfort. What did we do to add comfort? So on places where trolleys were run, we used low luminance luminaires and we offset them to one side so that they didn't have to be in the direct line of view for a person on a bed. In treatment rooms, again, with the general ambient lighting, we located it away from the bed to ensure it wasn't in direct line of sight. And the only lamp they could potentially be looking at is the examination lamp, which did not need to be on at all times. Treatment spaces too. We located or offset the lights using luminance-based principles and making certain people weren't sitting under lights. Same principle applied in the reflection space of the chapel and in bedrooms, both with high care needs and lower care needs. The whole focus was locating lights in such a way that if you were in bed, you weren't looking straight up at a light fixture. One thing you may not know about hospitals is they have an additional lighting regulation with regards to external lighting, and light levels are much higher than what you might find elsewhere. We're talking 50 lux at the main entry, 150 lux towards the emergency entry, and 20 lux in garden spaces which are accessed by staff and patients. So how do we deal with that high illumination adjacent a darkened sky? Now, the answer is through the graduation of luminance and brightness within the space. So here we have the example of where the roadway is lit to roadway lighting standards. We've added lighting to increase the brightness of the landscaped beds. And where we have 50 lux at the entry, we have also looked to try and increase brightness onto the ceiling, and where the fins are gathered, the lights are located to throw light onto the fins, increase the luminance, as well as increasing luminance onto the more solid sections of the glazed areas. So too with the emergency entrance, we had a graded increase of light, ending with 150 lux at the entry. The Royal Children's Hospital was groundbreaking for its time. The architect Bates Smart was bringing lots of light into patient areas, working on the premise and research that daylight and access to daylight has positive outcomes for recovery and of patients and their overall health. We were asked to look at circadian lighting with the electric lighting. Back at that time, we're talking 2000 to 2005, we're using fluorescent technology, metal halide technology, not very dimmable. Circadian rhythm was considered the color changing of light over time. Melanopic lux wasn't really a thing back then. And overall, the technologies that we had available to us and the lighting control systems meant that it was not an option for this hospital, and it was very much reliant on the daylight that the architect has so successfully brought into the space. By the time we get to Bendigo Hospital, we're talking 2013 to 2017, we do have LED in play, not in every light fixture. The efficiency still weren't great. Circadian rhythm was still not about melanopic lux. And we looked at using 2 LED strips and tuning them, but we could not use that tunable white in every single luminaire in the room. It didn't exist at the time, and luminaires would have been very, very large to try and accommodate it because of the performance of the LEDs themselves. Also, the lighting control side hadn't developed a lot, and it was very complex to create all those time signatures to enable the color change. In prototyping the solution, it was not a good outcome because there was stark contrast at time between the static white and the tunable white light, which were undesirable and felt uncomfortable in the space. So circadian rhythm lighting was not included in this, but we were able to use LEDs in creative ways, which I will get onto in a moment. Bendigo Hospital is an incredible, amazing space, and I was so glad to be able to work on it and work in an overarching sense, working very closely with Bates Smart, Silver Thomas, Hanley, and Oculus to include light into the space, into the various spaces to make it feel really, really nice. It is a regional hospital, which means it has to cover a wide variety of departments, including maternity, pediatrics, orthopedics, cancer care, mental health, aged care, and everything in between. It was incredible to the amount of light being brought into the hospital, and not only light, the amount of greenery and plant life being included. Courtyards and gardens weren't restricted to the ground plane, but were dotted throughout on several levels of the hospital. The creative ways we used LED was to help bring the familiar into an unfamiliar space. So in a very clinical imaging room, we were able to bring in a treetop canopy. Whilst you were waiting on your trolley to go into a procedure, a fairly scary procedure, you could take a moment out and be drawn into bush. So even though you're under cool white light, you could actually take a moment to disappear and find your calm in an image which was reminiscent of something you knew. We used red LEDs to help accentuate the wayfinding elements of the emergency department. And then there was the street. This had 3 different lighting conditions, and the architect wanted it to look seamless. Obviously, we wanted to look seamless too. We're talking about skylights. We're talking about areas which didn't have skylights, but wanted to look like skylights. And we had no light through the ceiling, but fully glazed walls. And this is a 3-story high space. So we introduced tunable white lighting to the faux skylights in order to try and make them match the real skylights. And then we supplemented it just with warm white light so that the whole space felt integrated and warm and welcoming. And this street was the main entrance, and it was where you went to lead off to all the different departments. As I said, there were tons and tons of gardens within the space, and some of the gardens themselves needed electric light help for the plants to grow because there was buildings towering up. Now, a different view of the garden is this one. So you can see we tried to make all the garden spaces feel like garden spaces. So rather than lighting off walls where we could, we integrated lighting onto the slabs. This garden in particular was adjacent the emergency department waiting area. So we effectively lit it so that it was beautiful to look in daytime, nighttime, from inside the garden and from inside the building, but from inside the internal spaces. And I would like to touch on the mental health gardens. Mental health gardens, we couldn't integrate lighting into any joinery. We couldn't integrate lighting into the ground plane at all because of risk that it would get pulled out and used as a weapon. We had to make certain the lighting wouldn't create a possibility for a person to hang themselves, so anti-ligature. In addition to that, we had the staff wanting light levels to be significantly high enough that there were no shadows and uniform enough that there were no shadows for people to hide in. And if they needed to, in an emergency, they could inject somebody. So it was a really interesting task to try and create a space where the patients would feel comfortable and relaxed and not in a prison yard and not being watched, and yet provide all these other requirements as well. And in the end, it was a bit of a compromise. The most difficult space within here was this mental health garden, where there was only one location where we could put the lights. So this was the only place where lights could go. And so creating a space where the people didn't feel like they were under floodlights or spotlights was really, really challenging. And you can see that the lights have lots of shielding on it. And it worked. It was effective. It worked, and the space actually feels quite nice. The last thing I wanted to say is, whilst I was working on Bendigo Hospital and noting that all this lovely daylight coming in for patients, there were also spaces which had zero access to daylight, and was on my way to circadian lighting and understanding health. And then the pandemic hit a couple of years later, and I was hearing the numbers of people who were health workers who were catching COVID, and it reignited the thought, we have circadian entrainment lighting, we have ways to support our circadian rhythm. So if we have healthcare workers who are working in a space without daylight, perhaps there's a way that we can support their health through the lighting. If you have questions, I'll be around later, and thank you for your time.